Hello, this video is going to talk about your assignment number 2. So this document, as you have seen, talks about what you need to do for your assignment. So it says write an interactive application in Python to get input from the user, do some calculation, and make at least one decision. So if, else statements, right? Okay. So I have a sample that we are going to go through and take a look at starting from the design document. So there is a template that you can use, and I've used the template to show you how to use that. And then we go on to write the Python program. We also talk about the rubric that is going to be used as we go through this. Okay, so here's the rubric. We will talk about that. And here is the sample that we are going to use, assignment 2 sample. And if you look in your assignment document, there are links to all of these things. There's a link to the sample, there's a link to the rubric, there's the link to the design document template. So we will start with the design document. So, and then the sample here has a link to this video, has a link to the program that we're going to take a look at once we are done talking about the design document. So the design document starts out by saying, start with a sample run to help with the design process. So we are going to start with a sample run. So a sample run is essentially how your program should look when it runs, right? What questions do you want to ask? And you must do this before you write your program, so it will give you an idea of what you want to do with your program. So this, for example, here's sample number 1. It says, welcome to my all-consuming calculation. That is a welcome message. And here are the questions that it's asking the user. What is something you consume daily? That's the question. The user answers paper napkins. How much consumed on a normal weekday? 6, whatever that 6 is quantity. How much consumed on a normal weekend day? 0. Then here is the message that I output. I do some calculations and I say you consume 1,560 paper napkins per year. And says that is way too many paper napkins in 1 year. So some kind of an error message, right? So what that tells you is this program reads a string from the user. It gets a number for a weekday, it gets a number for a weekend day. And essentially I calculate the number of napkins or whatever items they consume per year. So I assume that a weekday is, Monday through Friday, 5 days, weekend day, 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, and that there are 52 weeks in a year, things like that. So you can make some assumptions, or I give you those assumptions, right, depending on what you're asked to do. Here's the second sample. Again, the same message, right? The same welcome message, same questions. Questions shouldn't change because we are repeating our program. Now I answer pretzels, 0 on a weekday and 1 on a weekend day. And I calculate something, I get 104. It says you consume 104 pretzels per year. That's a reasonable number of pretzels in 1 year. So I must be looking at a certain number. And if the number is, I think, less than 1,000 is what I'm looking at, then it is reasonable. If it is more than 1,000, then I say, whoa, that's way too much. So you can come up with some of those numbers on your own. And then here's something with jelly beans. It says how much you consume in 1 year. So same thing, same program run, sample run, just different values, right? Kind of gives you an idea of how the program should look. So from this, if you go down to answer some of these questions, identify the user input. What are the data types for the input? So I need 3 inputs, right? We have asked them 3 questions. We read the name of the item, the amount on a weekday and amount on a weekend day. So this, as you can see, is a text, the jelly beans or paper napkins or whatever. These 2 are numbers, whole numbers. So I need 3 inputs from the user, a string called item consumed for the item name, and an int weekday for the number of items consumed on a weekday, and an int, which is a whole number, right? Weekend num for the number of items consumed on a weekend day. Then I go on to the next question, describe the program output. What is displayed to the user? What is displayed to the user? A message that says how many of those items are consumed per year. So the output that I need is the variable total num and a message based on the conditions described in step 4. So that is in your step 4 of your document. Okay, so if you go back to your document in step 4, it says what are the things that you need to look at. Total num is the total number of items consumed on a weekday or a weekend day. That is a variable that I need. Okay. What calculations do you need? In this case, here it shows the calculations. So 5 weekdays, like I said, take the item number, multiply by 5 times 52 weeks in a year. Then the same thing, weekend num times 2 weekend days, Saturday and Sunday, times 52. So that kind of gives me the amount consumed totally in 52 weeks or in 1 year. And I put that into total num. Okay. Now here's the process need to transform the input to the output. What am I doing? I'm checking if the total num, the calculation that I do, is greater than 1,000. If it is true, then I display the string you consumed so many items per year. This is way too many, the item name, I put that in there and say in 1 year. If false, then I say you consumed 104, items per year. And that's a reasonable number of pretzels in 1 year. So some of these numbers should be replaced by your variables. These names should be replaced by your items, right? If you put that in your program, it should output the corresponding numbers. So that's kind of how the design document works. So you answer all of those questions, you'll have a good algorithm. Now, if you go write your program, let's take a look at our program. We can kind of follow the steps in our design document, starting with step number 1. We declare 3 inputs to read from the user. So make sure you have your header. Then we start with our main. Make sure you have a def main. We want to always start with main. You output your welcome message. This is what I had there. I declare my variables. Item consumed is a string, so I initialize with a space. Weekday num, weekend num, and total num, remember our integer variables, we declare them all to be 0. Those are the variables that we said we needed in our design document. Okay, and then if you look at it, how do we calculate? Here's our calculations. But before we calculate, we need to read everything from the user. So item consumed, you tell them what is something you consume daily. There's your prompt. This is called your prompt. You output the prompt, you get a value. Now input, item consumed is just a string. So by default, Python reads a string, so you don't need to convert it. Again, by default, Python reads a string, but weekday num and weekend num are supposed to be integers. So we use this int parenthesis to convert that into integers. So the string that we get is converted to an integer and then put into these 2 variables. Then we take those and do our calculation. That essentially takes this and converts it into a total number of items that they consume in 1 year. Then I check if that is greater than or equal to 1,000. Now see, if total num, which is that variable, greater than or equal to 1,000, make sure you put the colon to say that's an if statement. Make sure your indentations are good inside the if. I have 2 statements. Actually, it's 1 statement. It goes to the next line. You consumed, comma, total num, item consumed. So this will say whatever the calculation gives me, 1,560 paper napkins per year. Separate all of these by commas. Notice this is my string. And again, every time you want to say something about their item, you just put that variable in there and you put them all together. Else, you say the same thing, but you just change the message a little bit. Say that is reasonable number of items consumed in 1 year, right? And so these are things that you can output however you want. Now let's take a look at the rubric with this program. This is all you need to do for your assignment number 2. So do some calculation, do some if statements, make sure it all flows, make sure the whole thing is put together and makes sense to you and to the user as a program. Right? Now the rubric, let's walk through the rubric so that will help you figure out if you have done everything. Right? Syntax and logic says program has no syntax errors. That means it works for all test data. So we must run it and test it. Let's run it. And here's some good spacing between all of these things where it says what is something you consume daily, and there's some space there. That's a good thing. Otherwise it looks very cramped. So let me say jelly beans. It says how much consumed on a normal weekday, I say 3. On a weekend day, I say 10. And it says you consumed 1,820 jelly beans per year. And it says that's way too many jelly beans in 1 year. So let's run it again and try a different item, pretzels. And maybe I say 0 on a weekday and 1 on a weekend day. And it says you consumed 104 pretzels per year. And that's reasonable. So the program works. I don't see any syntax errors. Syntax errors are errors that where you forget something. For example, if you forget a double quote, right, and you run it, it's going to say, oh, there's a syntax error. So then if you have an error like that, then that will essentially go back to our rubric. Let's see if I can fix this now. Okay, there we go. Space. So we go back to our rubric, and if you have syntax errors, then you get a 1. Then you got to fix it and resubmit it. Okay. Now what happens in between? Program works, but not for all test data. So maybe something was not quite done right. Maybe your if statement was not written correctly. Maybe you had some issues with that. Then if there was a small problem, then you get 3. Okay. Maybe you had a division by 0 error or something like that. Now, if you had logical errors, then that would be an if statement error. The if statement, probably you said less than or equal to 1,000 instead of greater than or equal to 1,000, or your logic was not right, then you get a 3, and so on and so forth. So make sure you read that. So this is all about syntax and logic. Modularity does not apply for this as much, so we're not going to talk about that. It does not apply because you have one function, that main, which we call at the end, which is important. So you must make sure you call main at the very end after you're done with everything. And as long as you have that one function, we are good. So modularity doesn't apply. Code style is, do you have all the spacing that is required? Do you have comments? Do you have comments on the top? Are the comments appropriate? Do you have comments in between? Do you have spacing between all of these? Are your variables appropriately named? Have you initialized them all to 0? These are all the questions you should ask yourself. And do you have spacing between these operators appropriately where you should? And between these commas and things like that. So the code is a little bit more readable than when you stick them all together. So that's code style. User interface talks about, have you asked them all the appropriate questions? Does it flow well? Do you have a welcome message? Have you asked them for some prompts? Do you give them good output? That's what code style, user interface talks about. And the algorithmic design document. Did you answer all your questions that we have provided in the template? Have you answered all of them completely? Have you declared all your variables, meaning have you told us what variables you need? Are the calculations there? Are the if statements there? Okay, so those are all the things that you need to look at before you submit your code. And that's for assignment 2.